"Name your price," the man said with a smile that never reached his eyes, as if human dignity could be measured in dollars and signed away like a contract, and for a moment, no one in the room questioned it because power had a way of making the unacceptable feel ordinary, especially in a place like this where silence was currency and morality was negotiable. But what happened next was something none of them were prepared for. The private dining hall shimmered under warm amber light, crystal glasses catching reflections of men who had built empires on control, their tailored suits whispering wealth with every movement, and at the center of it all stood Nia Carter, a waitress who had learned to become invisible, her posture straight, her expression calm, her hands steady despite the tension tightening in her chest, because invisibility meant survival and survival meant keeping her head down, even when conversations turned cold, even when laughter carried a sharper edge than it should. She had been working double shifts for weeks, saving every tip, every dollar, trying to stay afloat in a city that never slowed down, and tonight was no different, or at least it wasn't supposed to be, until her name was never spoken but her presence was suddenly chosen, pointed out like an object rather than a person, as Adrian Volkov, a man whose reputation filled rooms before he ever entered them, leaned back in his chair with a stillness that made others uneasy, his dark eyes scanning not the table, not the deal, but her, as if he had already decided something long before anyone else realized the game had changed. "I want her," he said quietly, not raising his voice, not needing to, because authority didn't shout, it simply existed, and the air shifted instantly, conversations cut short, laughter died mid-breath, and every gaze turned toward Nia, who felt the weight of it press against her skin like a spotlight she never asked for. Someone chuckled nervously. Another man leaned forward as if this were entertainment, a test, a negotiation tactic, but Nia didn't move, didn't step forward, didn't look away either, because something inside her refused to fold this time, even though every instinct told her to disappear, to comply, to survive like she always had, yet her fingers tightened slightly around the tray she held, grounding herself in the moment, reminding herself she was still standing, still breathing, still human. Across the table, the rival who had spoken first smirked, assuming control, assuming victory, as if this was just another transaction in a long list of them. But Adrian didn't look at him again, not once, his attention fixed, unblinking, unreadable, as though the room itself had faded into irrelevance, and for a brief second, something unfamiliar flickered in the silence, not fear, not anger, but anticipation, the kind that arrives just before everything changes. Nia finally lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes not with defiance, not with submission, but with something quieter, something steadier, a presence that refused to be reduced, and in that moment, the balance shifted in a way no one could explain, because whatever this was, it was no longer about price, and it was no longer about power, and the room, once filled with certainty, began to feel uncertain, as if everyone inside it had just stepped into a story they didn't understand, and Adrian Volkov, without moving another inch, had already rewritten the rules. The silence did not break immediately, and that was what made it unbearable, because in a room where men were used to controlling outcomes with a single word, hesitation felt like weakness, and yet no one spoke, not even the man who had made the offer, because something in Adrian Volkov's stillness suggested that whatever came next would not follow the rules they were used to. Nia felt it before she understood it, a shift that moved through the room like a quiet current, subtle but undeniable. And for the first time since she had taken this job, invisibility no longer felt like safety, it felt like erasure, and she was no longer sure she was willing to accept that, not tonight, not in front of men who looked at her as though she were a number waiting to be calculated. The rival across the table leaned back in his chair, forcing a laugh that sounded too sharp, too rehearsed, his fingers tapping once against the polished wood as he tried to reclaim control of a moment that had slipped from him. "You heard him," he said, gesturing lazily in her direction. "Everyone has a price, do not they?" And the question hung there, not because it needed an answer, but because it was meant to remind her of her place, to push her back into the silence she was expected to keep. Nia swallowed, her throat tight but her posture unchanged, and for a second, she thought about all the times she had said nothing, all the times she had let words pass through her like wind just to get through the night, but something about the way Adrian watched her, not with ownership, not with amusement, but with a kind of measured attention she could not quite name, made silence feel heavier than speaking. She set the tray down carefully on the edge of the table, the soft clink of glass against wood louder than it should have been, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet, steady, but impossible to ignore. I am not part of your deal, she said, each word deliberate, as if placing them one by one into a space that had never expected to hear them, and the reaction was immediate, not loud, not explosive, but sharp in the way a room inhales all at once, as if every person inside it had forgotten how to breathe. The rival's smile faded just enough to reveal something underneath, something irritated, something unaccustomed to resistance. And he leaned forward slightly, his tone lowering, not out of kindness, but out of control. Careful, he murmured, you are speaking out of turn, but Nia did not look at him, not this time, because the only gaze that seemed to matter in that moment was the one that had not wavered since the beginning, and when she met Adrian's eyes again, there was no apology there, no fear either, just a quiet certainty that surprised even her. Adrian tilted his head slightly, as if considering something beyond the obvious, beyond the room, beyond the deal itself, and for a brief moment, the corners of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, but something close enough to unsettle everyone watching, because it did not belong to the version of him they thought they knew. Interesting, he said softly, the word landing with more weight than a raised voice ever could, and then, without looking away from Nia, he added, most people answer that question differently, and the room, already unsteady, seemed to tilt further, because this was no longer about negotiation, it was no longer about power in the way they understood it, it had become something else entirely, something quieter, something sharper, something that did not need volume to command attention. The rival shifted in his seat, impatience breaking through the cracks of his composure. This is not a game, he snapped, but Adrian finally turned his gaze toward him, and the shift was immediate, like a door closing, like a line being drawn that no one else had seen until now. You are right, Adrian replied, his voice calm, controlled, absolute. It is not, and then he leaned forward just slightly, enough for the movement to register, enough for the entire room to feel it, which is why you should have been more careful about what you put on the table. And the words settled into the silence that followed, heavy, deliberate, and final, as if something invisible had just been decided, something that had nothing to do with price, and everything to do with who in that room still understood what dignity meant, and who had already forgotten. No one reached for their drink after that, not because they were told not to, but because something in the air made even the smallest movement feel like a decision, and in rooms like this, decisions were never made lightly. Nia stood where she was, aware of every breath, every shift of fabric, every glance that tried and failed to understand what had just happened, because this was no longer about a waitress stepping out of line. It was about a line that had been erased entirely, and no one seemed certain who had drawn it in the first place. The rival exhaled slowly, forcing control back into his posture, his fingers steepling as if he could rebuild authority through composure alone. You are making this unnecessarily complicated, he said, his tone measured but edged with something sharper now, something that hinted at frustration rather than confidence. We are here to finalize terms, not entertain interruptions. And for a moment, it sounded almost reasonable, almost like the world had not just tilted, almost like Nia had imagined the shift that still echoed in her chest. Adrian did not respond immediately, and that silence stretched, not empty, but full, like a space waiting to reveal something only a few could recognize. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, quieter, but it carried further. You are correct, he said, his gaze steady. We are here to finalize terms. And the rival leaned forward slightly, sensing an opening, sensing control returning, but Adrian continued before he could speak again, which is why we should be clear about what those terms actually are, and the subtle emphasis on the last word landed like a weight, not loud, not forceful, but undeniable. Nia felt it in the way the room shifted again, smaller this time, more precise, like something was being peeled back layer by layer, revealing what had always been there but rarely acknowledged, and she realized then that this was not about her alone, not entirely, it was about everyone watching, everyone choosing whether to remain silent or to see. The rival's expression tightened, just for a second, before he masked it again. The terms are simple, he said, we exchange assets, we secure loyalty, and we move forward. And there it was again. That language that reduced everything into pieces that could be traded, categorized, controlled. And for a moment, it almost sounded convincing, almost felt like the only way things could function in a world like this. But Adrian shook his head slightly, a small movement, almost unnoticeable, yet it carried the finality of something already decided. "No," he said, not raising his voice, not needing to, "those are your terms," and the distinction settled into the room like a quiet verdict. Nia watched as the rival leaned back again, slower this time, as if recalculating, as if trying to understand where the balance had shifted and how to recover it, but there was no clear path, no obvious correction, because whatever this was, it was not something he could negotiate his way out of. Adrian's gaze moved, not across the table, not to the men who had been so certain moments ago, but back to Nia, and for the first time since this began, there was something almost human in it, not soft, not gentle, but aware, as if he were acknowledging her presence not as part of the room, but as part of the equation that had just changed. "You said you are not part of this deal," he said, his voice even, giving her words back to her as if they mattered, as if they had weight beyond the moment. They were spoken, and Nia felt the room tighten again, waiting, watching, measuring what she would do next, but she did not hesitate this time, not because she was fearless, but because she understood now that silence would not protect her any more than speaking had. "I am not," she repeated, her voice steady despite the attention pressing in from every direction, and something in Adrian's expression shifted again, not dramatically, not enough for most to notice, but enough to change everything. That followed, he leaned back slightly, as if settling into a conclusion only he had seen coming, and when he spoke again, it was not to her, not directly, but to the room itself, to every person who had watched and said nothing. "Then she is the only one here who understands the value of what you are trying to sell," and the words did not sound like praise, they sounded like a judgment, quiet, precise, impossible to ignore. And the room, once filled with certainty, felt suddenly very small. No one dared to challenge that statement, not because they agreed, but because they recognized something irreversible had just been said, something that stripped the room of its usual illusions and left only truth standing in its place, quiet and uncomfortable. The rival's jaw tightened, his confidence now measured rather than effortless, as if every word he considered had to be weighed twice before being spoken. And for the first time since the evening began, he looked not at Adrian, but at the others around the table, searching for support that did not come, because no one wanted to be the next to speak and risk stepping into the same silence that had swallowed him. Nia remained still, but inside her, something was shifting, something she had buried for years under long shifts and quiet compliance, a memory of who she used to be before survival became her only priority, before every room felt like a place where she had to shrink just to exist. And now, standing here, she realized that shrinking had never truly protected her, it had only made it easier for others to overlook her entirely. Adrian watched this without interruption, his presence no longer dominating the room in the way it had before, but anchoring it instead, as if everything now moved in relation to the choice he had already made, a choice no one else fully understood yet. "This conversation is finished," he said at last, his tone even, final, leaving no space for negotiation, and it was not loud, not dramatic, but it carried the weight of a decision that could not be undone, and the rival understood it immediately. Even if he refused to accept it, "You are walking away from a deal worth 8 figures. He replied, the number hanging in the air like something that should have mattered more than anything else in the room, something that had always mattered more, until now. Adrian stood slowly, the movement deliberate, controlled, drawing every eye without effort, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer than before, but sharper. "I am walking away from a man who does not understand the difference between value and price." And the distinction landed with a clarity that cut deeper than any raised voice ever could. The room fell completely still, not a single chair shifting, not a single glass lifted, because they all understood what that meant, not just for the deal, but for the hierarchy they had relied on, the unspoken rules that governed how things were done, and in that moment, those rules felt less certain than they ever had. The rival exhaled through his nose, a controlled release of frustration, but he said nothing else, because there was nothing left to say that would not make the situation worse, and silence, for once, was the only option left to him. Adrian turned slightly, not toward the exit, not yet, but toward Nia, and for a brief second, the room seemed to disappear entirely, leaving only the space between them, and the weight of everything that had just happened settled into that moment. "You can go back to your work," he said, his tone no longer addressing the room, no longer carrying the authority meant for others, but something quieter, something almost respectful, as if he were giving her a choice rather than an order. Nia blinked once, the simplicity of the words catching her off guard. Because after everything, she had expected something more complicated, more demanding, but there was nothing hidden in his voice, no expectation beyond what he had said. She nodded slowly, her hand steady now as she reached for the tray she had set down earlier, and as she lifted it, she realized that for the first time since she had started this job, she was not trying to disappear, she was simply choosing to move. Behind her, the room remained silent, not out of fear, not entirely, but because something had shifted that no one could immediately explain, something that made every person present aware that they had just witnessed a line being drawn, not by force, not by power alone, but by something far rarer in a place like this, something that could not be bought, could not be negotiated, and could not be ignored once it revealed itself. And as Adrian finally turned toward the door, leaving the unfinished deal behind him, no one tried to stop him, because they understood, in a way they had not before, that some decisions did not need to be argued, they simply needed to be made, and this was one of them. The door closed behind Adrian without a sound, yet its absence echoed louder than anything that had been said inside that room, and for several long seconds, no one moved, as if they were all waiting for something to reverse, for someone to laugh it off and restore the familiar order they depended on, but nothing came, and the silence remained, stretching thin across polished wood and untouched glasses. Nia stepped back into the rhythm of her work, but it felt different now, not because the tasks had changed, but because she had, her movements no longer shaped by the need to disappear, but by a quiet awareness that she had been seen. Truly seen, in a way that made invisibility impossible to return to. The rival remained seated, his fingers resting against the table, his gaze fixed on the spot where Adrian had been, as if calculating a response long after the moment had passed, but the room around him offered no support, no agreement, only distance. Because the others had already begun to shift their loyalty in the only way that mattered in a place like this, by choosing silence over alignment. One by one, chairs moved back. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a careful distance, as though proximity itself had become a risk, and the unspoken message settled in without anyone needing to voice it, that the deal was not just unfinished, it was over. Nia carried a tray toward the service station, her hands steady, her breath even, but her mind still replaying the moment that had changed everything, the way her words had not disappeared into the air, the way they had been returned to her with weight, with acknowledgement, and she realized then that what had happened was not an interruption, it was a correction, something that had been waiting to surface long before she stepped into that room. Behind her, the rival finally stood, slower than before, his movements controlled but lacking the effortless authority he had carried earlier, and when he spoke, it was not to the room, not to anyone in particular, but to himself in a tone just loud enough to be heard. This is not finished, yet the words did not carry the same certainty they once might have, because the outcome had already shifted beyond his reach. Outside the private dining hall, the hallway felt cooler, quieter, removed from the tension that still lingered behind closed doors, and Adrian paused there for a moment, his expression unreadable, as if he were not reflecting on what he had done, but on what it revealed, something about the people he chose to work with, something about the lines he refused to cross, even when no one else would have questioned it. One of his associates approached, careful, measured, as though aware that this was not a moment for assumptions, that was a significant decision, he said, choosing his words deliberately, and Adrian glanced at him briefly, not dismissive, not defensive, simply certain. So was theirs, he replied, and the simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any explanation could have. Back inside, Nia placed the tray down and exhaled quietly, her reflection catching for a split second in the polished surface of a steel counter, and for the first time in a long while, she did not look away from it, because the person looking back was not smaller, not quieter, not fading into the background. She was present, fully, undeniably present, and that realization settled into her with a steadiness that no amount of money, no offer, no transaction could ever replicate. The night continued, as nights always did, orders placed, plates served, conversations resumed in lower tones, but something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be undone or ignored. Because once a line is drawn clearly enough, it becomes impossible to pretend it was never there, and everyone in that room, whether they admitted it or not, had seen exactly where that line was. The night did not return to normal, even though everything tried to pretend that it had. because once a room has witnessed a truth it cannot unsee, the silence that follows is never the same again, and Nia could feel it in the way voices lowered when she passed, in the way eyes avoided lingering too long, not out of disrespect, but out of something closer to uncertainty. She moved between tables with practiced precision, refilling glasses, clearing plates, maintaining the rhythm she had mastered over years of working without being noticed, yet now every step carried a different weight, not heavier, but more deliberate, as if each action belonged to her instead of being dictated by expectation. In the kitchen, the usual noise continued, orders called out, dishes stacked, conversations overlapping in the background, but even there, something had shifted, subtle but present, because word traveled quickly in places like this, not through announcements, but through glances and tones, through the way one person hesitated before speaking, and another chose not to interrupt. A coworker brushed past her, pausing just long enough to offer a brief look, not pity, not curiosity, but something closer to respect, unspoken and fleeting, yet undeniable, and Nia felt it settle quietly, not as validation, but as recognition. Across the building, in a private corridor lined with soft lighting and polished marble floors, Adrian walked without urgency, his pace steady, his expression unchanged, as though the decision he had made required no further thought, but the man beside him was less composed. His step slightly quicker, his silence heavier with questions he was careful not to ask outright. "That room will talk about this," the associate said finally, choosing his words with care, and Adrian nodded once, not dismissing it, not emphasizing it, simply acknowledging what was obvious. "They already are," he replied, his voice even, because in his world, reputation was not built on what was said in public, but on what was understood in private. The associate hesitated, then added, "You walked away from more than just a deal," and this time Adrian stopped, not abruptly, but with intention, turning just enough to meet his gaze. "No," he said calmly, "I walked away from a mistake before it became a habit," and the distinction settled between them, clear and final. Back inside, Nia stepped into the staff hallway for a moment, the noise of the dining room fading behind her, replaced by a quieter space where she could finally breathe without the weight of observation pressing against her, and for a second, she leaned against the wall, not out of exhaustion, but to steady the realization that had been building since the moment she spoke, that nothing about her circumstances had changed. Her paycheck was the same, her responsibilities unchanged, and yet something fundamental was different, something internal, something that could not be taken or traded, because it had never truly belonged to anyone else. She closed her eyes briefly, recalling the exact moment her voice did not shake, the exact moment she chose not to disappear, and she understood now that it had not been courage in the way people often described it, loud and fearless. It had been something quieter, something steadier, a refusal to let someone else define her worth. When she opened her eyes again, the reflection in the small mirror near the exit caught her attention, and she held it this time, not out of habit, but out of recognition, because the person looking back was not waiting for permission anymore. Somewhere beyond the walls, conversations would continue, decisions would be made, alliances would shift, but here, in this moment, none of that mattered as much as the simple, undeniable truth that had revealed itself tonight. That dignity was not something granted by power, and it was not something that could be negotiated away. It was something carried, quietly, firmly, until the world had no choice but to see it, and once it did, everything changed, whether anyone was ready for it or not. By the time the last table was cleared and the final check was signed, the restaurant no longer felt like the same place it had been just a few hours earlier, not because the furniture had changed or the lighting had dimmed, but because something unseen had settled into the walls, something that lingered in the quiet exchanges between staff and guests, in the way conversations paused when certain names were mentioned, in the way people chose their words more carefully than before. Nia tied the apron strings behind her back more slowly than usual, her fingers steady but thoughtful, as if the simple motion carried more meaning now than it ever had, and when she stepped out onto the main floor one last time, she noticed how the room seemed smaller, not physically, but in the way it no longer held the same invisible weight over her. Her manager approached, his expression composed but not entirely neutral, as though he had spent the past hour deciding how to address something he did not fully understand. "You handled yourself well tonight," he said, the words measured, cautious, not quite praise. not quite surprise, and Nia met his gaze without hesitation, offering a small nod, because there was nothing to explain, nothing to justify, only a quiet acknowledgement that something had happened that could not be undone. Outside, the city air felt cooler, the kind that carried the distant hum of traffic and the faint echo of conversations drifting through open doors, and Nia stepped onto the sidewalk with a slower breath, as if she were crossing into a space that belonged to her in a way the dining room never had. Across the street, a black car waited, its presence subtle but deliberate, blending into the night in a way that suggested it had been there long before anyone noticed, and for a moment, she considered walking past it, continuing down the block toward the train station. Toward the routine she had followed for years without question, but something held her there, not curiosity, not fear, but recognition. The window lowered just enough for a voice to reach her, calm, controlled, unmistakable, Miss Carter, and she turned slightly, not startled, not uncertain, simply aware that this was not a coincidence. Adrian sat inside, his expression unchanged from earlier, as though the events of the night had not altered him in any visible way, yet there was something different in the way he looked at her now, something that did not belong to the same dynamic that had existed before. "You are off the clock," he said, not as a question, but as a statement, and she nodded once, her posture relaxed but grounded, because whatever this was, it was not the same as what had happened inside. There was a brief pause, the kind that carried more weight than words, before he continued. "Then this is no longer about your job," and the distinction landed quietly, but firmly, drawing a line between who she had been in that room and who she was now standing on the sidewalk under the city lights. Nia studied him for a moment, not searching for answers, but measuring the space between them, the difference in power that still existed, the difference in experience, in influence, in everything that defined their worlds, and yet, for the first time, it did not feel like something that diminished her presence. It simply existed. "Then what is it about?" she asked. Her voice even, not challenging, not cautious, just clear, and Adrian's gaze held steady, not shifting, not softening, but acknowledging the question in a way that suggested he had already considered it. "It is about a choice," he said finally, each word deliberate, as if he understood the weight they carried. "Yours, not mine," and the air between them stilled, not tense, not uncertain, but focused, as though everything that had happened was leading to this moment, this quiet intersection of paths that neither of them had expected. Nia felt the city move around them, cars passing, footsteps echoing, distant voices rising and falling, but none of it seemed to intrude on the space they occupied. Because whatever this was, it existed outside of the usual noise, outside of the assumptions that had defined the night so far, and she realized then that this was not about being chosen, not in the way it had first appeared. It was about being seen, and deciding what to do with that recognition once it could no longer be ignored. The city did not pause for moments like this, it never did, and yet somehow the space between them felt removed from everything around it, as if time had slowed just enough to let a decision take shape without interference. Nia studied him carefully, not intimidated, not impressed, but aware, fully aware of the difference between the world he came from and the one she had been navigating her entire life. And she understood that whatever he was offering was not simple, not casual, and certainly not without consequence. Adrian did not rush her, did not fill the silence with persuasion or expectation. He simply waited, his presence steady, controlled, as though he respected the weight of her choice enough not to interfere with it. "You said it is my choice," she said finally, her voice calm, grounded, not searching for confirmation but stating the reality of what he had just placed in front of her. And he inclined his head slightly, a small acknowledgement that carried more respect than any elaborate reassurance could have. "It is," he replied, his tone even, "and it will remain that way," and there was no pressure in his words, no hidden urgency, only a clarity that made it impossible to misunderstand. Nia glanced down the street, toward the direction she usually walked, the familiar path that led to the train, to the apartment she had worked so hard to keep, to the life she had built piece by piece through consistency and endurance, and for a moment, it felt like two different versions of herself stood at that intersection, one that continued forward unchanged, and another that stepped into something unknown, something uncertain, but undeniably different. She thought about the room, about the way her voice had not disappeared, about the way it had been heard and returned with weight, and she realized that whatever she chose now, she could not go back to pretending that her presence did not matter, because that illusion had already been broken. What exactly are you asking, she said, her eyes returning to him, not hesitant, but precise, because she understood that clarity was the only thing that could make a decision like this real. Adrian did not look away, his expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in the way he spoke, as if he were choosing his words more carefully than he had earlier in the night. I am not asking you to work for me, he said, and that alone shifted the ground beneath the conversation, because it removed the assumption that had been lingering unspoken. I am asking you to consider a different path, one that does not require you to disappear in order to survive, and the words settled into the space between them, not as an offer of power, not as a transaction, but as an alternative. Nia felt something tighten in her chest. Not fear, not doubt, but recognition, because he was not offering her a position, he was offering her a choice to redefine how she existed in the world, and that was something far more significant than any job could ever be. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing as she processed the weight of what he had said, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a quiet certainty that had not been there before. And if I say no, she asked, not challenging, but ensuring that the reality remained balanced. And Adrian's answer came without hesitation, then you walk away exactly as you are now, he said, his tone steady, with nothing owed, nothing expected, and there was no disappointment in it, no attempt to persuade her otherwise, only a simple acknowledgement that her decision would define everything that followed. The city moved around them, headlights passing, distant sirens echoing faintly, but in that moment, none of it felt as significant as the space they occupied, because for the first time in a long time, Nia was not reacting to circumstances, she was choosing them, and that difference, subtle as it seemed, changed everything. She held his gaze for a moment longer, not searching for approval, not measuring his reaction, but confirming something within herself, something that had been building since the moment she refused to be reduced to a price. And when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, steady, and entirely her own. Then I need to understand what that path really looks like. And the words did not sound like acceptance, nor did they sound like refusal, they sounded like something far more important, the beginning of a decision made with full awareness. And Adrian, for the first time since this conversation began, allowed the slightest shift in his expression, not satisfaction, not victory, but recognition, because he understood that this was not about convincing her, it was about meeting her where she already stood, and respecting the fact that she would only move forward on her own terms. Adrian did not answer immediately, and that pause was not hesitation, it was intention, the kind that weighed every word before allowing it to exist. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, grounded in something deeper than authority. It looks like this, he said, gesturing lightly to the space around them, not the car, not the building, but the moment itself. You decide what you will not accept, and everything else builds from there, and the simplicity of it carried more truth than any elaborate promise could have. Nia listened without interrupting, because she understood that what he was offering was not a position, not a title, but a perspective, one that could not be given unless she chose to hold it. And for a moment, she let the weight of that settle fully, not rushing to respond, not filling the silence with uncertainty, but allowing herself to stand in it, grounded and present. The city moved around them as it always did, cars passing in steady rhythm, footsteps echoing against pavement, distant conversations blending into a low hum, but none of it felt as immediate as the decision forming quietly within her, because for the first time, she was not reacting to what the world expected, she was defining what she would allow. I spent a long time thinking survival meant staying invisible, she said finally, her voice calm but reflective, not directed at him alone, but at the truth she had carried for years. But tonight proved that disappearing never really protected anything, and the words lingered between them, not heavy, not fragile, just honest. Adrian watched her with the same steady attention, not interrupting, not guiding, simply allowing her to arrive at her own conclusion. And in that moment, the distance between them felt less like a divide and more like a space where understanding could exist without imbalance. Nia exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing as the decision settled into place, not dramatic, not sudden, but certain in a way that left no room for doubt. I am not looking for someone to change my life, she continued, her gaze steady. I am deciding how I will live it. And there was no challenge in her tone, no need to prove anything, only a quiet clarity that defined her stance more powerfully than any argument could have. Adrian inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the distinction, because he understood that what she had just said was not a rejection, and it was not acceptance in the way most people expected, it was ownership, and that was something far rarer. Then you already understand more than most people in that room ever will, he replied, his voice even, carrying no judgment, only recognition, and for a brief moment, the air between them felt lighter, not because the situation had changed, but because it had been defined on terms that neither of them needed to question. Nia glanced once more down the street, toward the path she had walked countless times before, and this time, it did not feel like a default, it felt like a choice, one she was making consciously, fully aware of its weight, and when she looked back at him, there was no hesitation left. I am going to keep walking, she said, not as a dismissal, but as a statement of direction, but I am not walking the same way I did before, and the distinction was subtle, yet absolute. Adrian nodded once, accepting it without resistance, without persuasion, because this had never been about convincing her to follow him. It had been about recognizing whether she was capable of standing on her own terms, and she had already answered that question. He did not offer anything else, did not extend the moment beyond what it needed to be, because some decisions did not require closure, they required space, and as Nia turned and began to walk down the street, her step steady, her posture unchanged yet somehow different, the city seemed to open around her in a way it had not before, not because the world had shifted, but because she had, behind her. The car remained for a moment longer before moving quietly into the flow of traffic, blending into the night as if it had never been there, leaving nothing behind but the echo of a moment that had changed everything without needing to claim it, and in the quiet rhythm of her footsteps against the pavement, one truth remained, clear and undeniable, that dignity does not ask for permission, and once it is claimed, it reshapes every path that follows.